Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Manomet's Small Sit virtual series featuring Manomet Conservation Sciences Senior Fellow Trevor Lloyd-Evans. I'm Gina O'Rourke, Manomet's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. I'm going to be your MC today. And if you're new to Manomet, a little background on our organization. We use science and collaboration to reverse shorebird decline, promote coastal resilience, and educate and inspire the next generation of conservationists across the Western Hemisphere. And if you're a friend, volunteer, trustee, counselor, or donor to Manomet already, then thank you. It's only with your support that we can continue to get our boots muddy, doing hands-on science in collaboration with local partners. And before I introduce Trevor, just a couple housekeeping notes for today's webinar. First, we'd love for attendees to type into the chat where you're all zooming in from. We have a nice number of attendees, and then we're going to reserve the chat for any tech issues you might be having that we might be able to resolve on the back end. And we do welcome your curiosity, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, and Trevor's going to be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation as time allows. And a bit of background about Trevor. He began his early career across the pond at the British Trust for Ornithology, after which he came to Manomet. He's been a mainstay of Manomet and our work for almost 5 decades, having arrived in 1972 to supervise the banding program. Over the years, Trevor has trained thousands of young biologists through the Manomet internship program and inspired generations of students by sharing the wonders of the natural world. I could go on and on about Trevor because his CV is about 8 pages long with examples of esteemed teaching positions, book reviews, reports, and publications. But we're here to talk about the most recent Christmas bird count, which is work near and dear to Trevor's heart. And I'm told often includes pots of homemade soup. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Trevor.
Okay, Jean, thank you. I don't know, I feel venerable or something. Well, with any luck, we're talking about Christmas counts today, which is fun and is more than just fun. It's actually a fantastic data source. So here we go. We're looking at a Christmas bird count, and one of my favorite birds and one of a lot of people's favorite birds. Anyone who is exceedingly sharp-eyed will obviously want to quibble because this bluebird is holding a caterpillar in his beak, and he's actually heading into a nest, but never mind. At this time of year, we have seen increases in species like bluebirds and some southern species, and that is because we have been able to look at data over a very long time. But not just us, Christmas bird counts in general started as early as 1900 and have continued every Christmas tide ever since, right up through the current year. So let's have a quick look at the history. The history was that in this country, particularly also in Europe, on Boxing Day, which was the day after Christmas, the gentry would go out with all of their firearms and see how many birds they could shoot. It was called the Boxing Day hunt. And that caught on over here in North America, as well as the Christmas side hunt, usually called. And that continued for a while. But there was an ornithologist called Frank Chapman. Some of you may have had bird books by Frank Chapman. And in 1900, Frank Chapman and some of the people who were part of the Audubon Society, which then now became the National Audubon Society more recently, decided to try to replace that, see if we could stop the slaughter, good idea, and see if we could actually turn this into something that would provide data. And I am sure they didn't realize exactly how much data would happen over the years, but they proposed a Christmas bird census. Originally, there were just 25 counts. In Canada, you can see that was in Toronto, actually, down a few of the big cities in the eastern United States, over in California. And that really continued right through the current situation. It's now stabilized as one count, so one 24-hour day. You get up anytime you like after midnight, and you carry on until the next midnight, all the way through if you like. Owls, for example, always good to go and get those if you can. And the count is your one day sometime between December 14th and January 5th, just one of those days. Each circle is standardized throughout all of the areas that count. It's a 15-mile diameter. So it's a fairly large circle. For example, the Plymouth one goes from Cape Cod Canal all the way up to the tip of Plymouth Beach and North Plymouth. So that sort of idea, all the way into Carver in the west. And as far as you can see out to sea in the east, which we all cheat on. We can see it from our circle, we count it. This is divided into sub-areas, and you have parties of people going out and counting all the birds they can see while they're in the field. And recently, especially, people have always been encouraged by National Audubon and by us to stay home and count at your yards and bird feeders if you wish to contribute that way. And it helps if it's in a sort of an organized group. For example, the Pine Hills Bird Group in the Pine Hills cover their area. The Redbrook Community Bird Group down in South Plymouth joined us today. So everyone is looking for birds and ideally not overlapping the areas. So no cheating, no going into somebody else's area. How many are there? This was the 2023-24, so not this Christmas, but last Christmas. And these are all of the circles. You can see, looking at the top map of eastern Massachusetts there are several circles all the way in the Cape and the islands, then all the way up the coast, but a lot inland as well. And then down below, we can see an immense number of circles. So the data are that this has really taken off. Not very many birds are being shot, I suspect, on Boxing Day at this point, or the day after Christmas, and 2,677 circles. It's not just the USA. Canada has been an early adopter, and now there are counts in Central America, Caribbean, Pacific Islands. Audubon data showed that there were 83,000 odd participants last Christmas, and 40 million plus birds counted. I mean, this really gives extreme coverage. 2,380 species identified. That's far more than there are in North America, because now they're including Central and bits of South America as well. So that's coming in. And you can look at this and far more data if you go to the Audubon Christmas bird count site, which we have there. So what about our count? Our count is centered on Manomet, actually on Beaver Dam Road in Manomet. And this winter we went out. We went into there are 13,154 birds this year. Yeah, 13,154 birds, 102 species, which was very nice as it came in there. We found that we had 46 participants this year going through the area. And you can see the circle on around Plymouth there, going from the tip of Plymouth Beach down to the Cape Cod Canal. This year was somewhat miserable. The temperatures were in the 30s, and that's nice, but there were steady winds, 25 miles an hour, and the gusts were something over 60 miles an hour. So this was our windiest count in all the 51 years. We've been counting from 1974 through to this year. And the problem with a windy count like that is that we can't get the birds to look at us. We can't pish, we can't use our tapes. And for those who like to use bird tapes to see if they can get a bird to just show itself. And the sea is rough, the birds are keeping a low profile. So what do we see when we start looking at the long-term data? And I think the long-term data are probably the more exciting part of this. You can see some graphs here, and the Plymouth CBC, individual birds, that's the pink graph. And from 1974 right down until the last count, put them all on here, you can see that there's a long, slow, steady decline in birds. That makes sense, because anyone who's been looking at the conservation news over the last 20, 30, 40, whatever years is aware that bird populations are declining. We've all heard about the 3 billion birds that have gone since about the 1970s. And that, unfortunately, is confirmed by Manomet's counts, like the spring and fall bird banding of land birds, the shorebird counts. And we're seeing long, slow, steady decreases in the number of individual birds. The graph of bird species, which is the blue graph on the top, is interesting. Number of species has actually not exactly gone up, but been pretty steady over all the years. And incidentally, if you look at the very last dot there, you'll see a big drop, and that's the windy day. We found 102 species, and normally we find about 110 species in our Plymouth count. So things are going on. We are finding that more southern birds are increasing, and they are coming into New England, and as the climate warms, some of them are staying. So people who have been around birding for quite a while now will realize that there are more double-crested cormorants staying down in the canal as opposed to heading off south for the winter. Longer term, if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, there were more or less no titmice, no red-bellied woodpeckers, no house finches in Massachusetts, and those species came up from the south, established and increased. So those are range expansions moving northwards, and in retrospect, probably that has a whole lot to do with the warming climate. The yellow graph down in the sort of bottom left there is the number of birds per party hour. And there we're seeing the yellow graph, a slow, steady decrease. Now, you would think that there would be more birds per party hour if you had more people. So how does Audubon get around that? The idea is that we stay within groups. And so one party of one person can go out and see X number of birds. If you add a second person to that group, now you're 2 people, probably you'll see more birds. But how much more do you do? How far do you sort of push that? And so by the time you get to 15 people or 16 people all in a large group, I don't think the 16th person adds many birds. So that's one of the drawbacks of Christmas bird count. It is expressed probably best as number of birds per party hour. And then the parties in their separate units within the circle are all added up. And the machinery cranks that out, and we can see all of these data on the Audubon website. The other thing that's happened is that the maximum and minimum temperatures, and these are just the Manomet count, but it's true for everybody, are slowly and steadily increasing. The bottom right graph, the red is the high temperature that we recorded each day from 1974 up through this year. And the blue is the cold weather. You can see a couple of really cold dips, which was unfortunate, and very cold and very miserable and down near 0. And that was, what, 87, 88, somewhere in there. And this year, you can see that there has been a bit of a dip, but basically temperatures overall warming. So we're about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 3 degrees centigrade warmer now than we were in the 70s. And that presumably is leading to quite a number of the changes in bird populations. So what can we learn from CBC's Christmas bird counts? The fun part for some of us is that we find rare birds, and that's always exciting. Rare birds is kind of depends who you are and where you are. For us this year, Liana D'Annunzio was wandering out actually just after the count, but within the period that we count birds sometimes, and found 2 black skimmers on Brown's Bank just off the end of Plymouth Beach. I don't know whether they were there on the day or not. We do record within the week, so no, they don't quite get into the data, but that's quite exceptional. Finding black skimmers anywhere in New England in winter is crazy. What on earth is happening there? And yet there were some in the tip of Long Island, and there were some down in Virginia, and we had extremely strong southwest winds and gales blowing before the Christmas bird count. So very often a southern bird, if you're lucky, will turn up here. Is it good for the bird? Not necessarily. Some of them turn around and disappear, and these skimmers did. They vanished immediately. Other birds, eruptive species. Eruptive species usually come down from the north, as far as we are concerned up here in New England. So we're looking north to what do we have? And the snowy owl is a classic. I believe there are probably 3 snowy owls on Duxbury Beach right now. So that sort of species either has population increases or population decreases depending on food. You can see a lemming in my hand. You can also see a little bit of blood on my thumb where he bit me while the photographer said, "Oh, hold him, please, please, I need a photograph." So at least I got a copy of the photograph. And if the lemming population explodes, then snowy owls do really well in the Arctic, and that would be Arctic Canada and up into northern Alaska, where Manomet has done quite a lot of work, Stephen Brown and the shorebird people. And I've had the opportunity to go up into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and work on shorebirds over a number of years. And if there is a crash in vole populations because of too many of them breeding, then the owl population also to some extent crashes. There isn't as much food and fewer nestlings will be raised. So it could be cold weather up north, but things like snowy owls are just fine with cold weather. They're very well insulated. It probably has more to do with food for many of these birds. Other eruptive species are mostly finches. You might want to think of purple finch coming down south in good numbers. Occasionally, bird watchers, especially along the coast, will find crossbills, and that depends on cone crops. So if the pine cones and the spruce cones in the north have a down year as opposed to an up year, then the species that would normally winter further north and continue to eat those seeds will move south and find better foraging further down here. So from our point of view in Plymouth, do birds come down from the north? Don't they? This was not an eruption year, and so there were perhaps fewer birds because of that. And then also the sort of main effect, I think, is that ranges are changing. And so we can, over the long-term data from Manomet, we've got 51 years of data, but some of, as we said, some of the Christmas bird counts go back to 1900. So those long-term data really have shown differences in ranges of species, and especially ranges changing due to climate change, due to the warming climate as birds move northwards. We might take a few examples here. We can graph individual bird species from our data. So here we have a bluebird and a house finch. Bluebirds, our sort of keynote bird that we started with, have been increasing, probably because more people are putting out bird houses, bird boxes, probably because the climate is a little warmer, and almost certainly because people are putting out bird food. And in fact, I have bluebirds behind me right now, eating my peanut butter and eating some of my larvae that we put out there. So they're extremely happy about that. And the data there show that they were extremely uncommon in the top bluebird graph, the blue line going along in the 70s. We would occasionally find a bluebird. We'd be quite excited. Oh, somebody in Area 4 got a bluebird. That's good. And now we're finding that more and more of them are spending the winter here. House finch was another bird, and house finch was a different story. The house finch on the right is a nice male house finch, also benefiting greatly from birdseed. And prior to 1960, there were no house finches in the eastern part of well, not only in eastern Massachusetts, but anywhere in eastern North America. They were a southwestern bird. They were in Texas and California and down into Mexico. But house finches were taken as cage birds back in the teens and released in New York City, or escaped in New York City. And around about 1960, they began to survive well in the wild in the east and start expanding their range. In the early 60s, they turned up on Cape Cod, and now house finches have increased all the way up and down the east coast. The western population, the wild, the original native population, has also been expanding, so something is happening with house finches. and they really peaked. If you look at the graph down below, 1974, there were some house finches around, and then really peaked in the 1990, 91, 92, 93, 94. That was when house finches really hit a maximum in eastern Mass. This is just from our own data in the Plymouth count. And some of you also may remember that when you have too many birds in one place and maybe feeders not being cleaned out as much as they should, or maybe just too many birds roosting together, then there was a conjunctivitis and eye disease that affected quite a lot of house finches, and the numbers declined. And we've seen this pattern. If you sort of carry on, you can see from the 90s all the way up to modern times, house finches declined and dropped down to what we'll call a carrying capacity. The same sort of thing happened with mockingbirds. Mockingbirds were not here in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And now the mockingbirds are throughout the whole area. They increased and then they dropped off. So I think sort of birders who've been birding for quite a while now will note that we're not seeing as many mockingbirds as we did back in the 90s, 80s, 90s, that sort of time. So looking at populations over time, there are winners and there are losers. We'll end on a higher note, so let's look at some losers first. And one of the losers I've particularly noted is American kestrel, and that certainly shows up from our data. The top graph with the red line is the number of American kestrels from 1974 through this year that we have found, and the number was never very high in the Plymouth count only. And our peak were 15 of them. So there would be kestrels around the cranberry bogs, kestrels nesting in hollow trees occasionally. And the number has just decreased steadily. And that unfortunately is true over the whole Northeast. One way of looking at the Christmas count data is to look at breeding bird data from the breeding bird atlases, or from the breeding bird census, which is a North American census of breeding birds during the breeding season. And unfortunately, the story is the same no matter what you look at. American kestrel in the Northeast has been declining steadily from the 70s all the way up to the current period. Don't think we really know what the answer is. The landscapes are certainly changing. Habitat loss will affect birds in whatever habitat is being lost. So during the agricultural period in New England, there were many more birds of open grasslands, birds like meadowlarks, for example, or some of the shorebirds. And those have been decreasing because the grasslands grew up at the end of the agricultural period and turned into forest. And now the forest is changing again and turning into houses. So some birds adapt well to the landscape and some birds don't. And kestrel seems to be a loser. The climate warming, I don't think, has any effect on kestrels. That seems unlikely, but a warming climate for some of the northern species that might have come down here in colder winters may well be staying further north. So that might affect some of the northern species that now do not have to come so far south. And I think kestrels are very much a grassland bird and very much an insect and sort of small moth, butterfly, grasshopper type eater, as well as maybe a few other birds. But mostly very, very small birds, but mostly kestrels are insect eaters. And I think the increase during these years, and back in the 50s, in fact, but obviously since we've been looking at the 70s, in herbicides and pesticides, both industrially in the farming areas and also in everyone's backyard, if you use too many of them, has caused a tremendous drop in insect populations. Ask any of the butterfly people, ask beekeepers. And occasionally I put in avian influenza here because actually there is a disastrous outbreak just in Billington Sea in Plymouth right now. Over 80 waterfowl, swans and ducks have been found dead just over the last few days. And so avian influenza, which usually is brought in from abroad and usually affects chickens and ducks and domestic birds, can also affect some of our native species. And we're particularly concerned because the scavengers coming in to eat the dead geese or to kill the not very happy geese and the waterfowl, include bald eagles. Some of my friends have told me that they have seen northern harrier, red-tailed hawk, and certainly crows and ravens going in and scavenging the dead birds on the ice in some of the frozen ponds in eastern Plymouth and Carver and some of these areas. And this again will spread the influenza. So we're concerned about that, and occasionally when populations build up, that does happen. We also have the same data being used, I think, very broadly now. National Audubon has been very good at conservation awareness. And I think as more people are introduced to birds and join their local Audubons, the Massachusetts Audubon, the Manomet Bird Observatory, the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences, we change our name, the other conservation organizations that begin to not just look at what birds can we see, how many are there, which is always the fun part of it, but what does this tell us about our approaches to conservation? And that has been a theme, as Jean mentioned in the introduction, at Manomet. We have the International Shorebird Survey. We have started the Western Hemisphere shorebird habitat, stopover habitat surveys for quite a long time now. So there's a network there looking right down into Central and South America, as well as all the way up into North America. And this depends upon people knowing what is going on, scientists trying to find out, volunteers trying to count birds, and contributing all this data. The other part of it, and Manomet is always interested in this, is the education aspect. So we educate everyone from students who have just finished their undergraduate degree and want to come along and work with our scientists and learn some of the techniques. And we also believe in having young folks get involved as soon as possible. And we have worked with that over the years. So before you tackle any of the conservation problems, you need the long-term science. And I think the Christmas bird counts are just one of those parts of long-term science that have been a really fun way to contribute and also to really work to the benefit of conservation and to the benefit of protecting some of these species. Jean, you mentioned that we would like to leave some time for questions, and I would
We
really
do.
like to leave some time for questions. So why don't I
Fantastic.
start now? And if anyone has texted you a question, let's see what we can do about it.
Absolutely. I've got a question here, and it's from an anonymous attendee, and it says the losers list, not birds, look like it is due to human behavior. Where do we start rechanging human impact? Is it policy only, or can local change make a difference? What would that be? It seems to me it comes down to habitat as well as focusing on imperiled species. What's your opinion on that? It was a multi-pronged question.
That is a huge question, and really comes to the sort of the nexus of everything.
Mhm.
Yes, some people have started talking about the Anthropocene. You've probably heard that phrase, most of us by now. And what that really is the short-term description of is the immense changes that humans have caused because there are so many of us, and because we have been able now to affect extremely large areas. We can go back to the 1700s, and there were a number of, almost everyone was a farmer or a settler or an early settler. And there's a little bit of agriculture going on, but there was a lot of forest, and there was much more wildlife. And now we have really got factory farming in a sense. Huge areas, fields have expanded because that's more efficient. We have more people in America. We have more people in the world. We need feeding, so we need more food. You remove the hedges, you use more herbicides, you use more pesticides. Yes, we take away forest land and we put in suburban developments because there are more people who need houses. So yes, it's the number of people. We are looking at birds in North America that are not just North American birds. The shorebirds and many of the land birds migrate. And so other effects would be the cutting of the rainforest, for example, in South America. The whole concept of are humans causing most of the problems? Yeah, probably. But there has always been change. Looking back into the geological record, something well over 90% of all the species that have ever lived, we assume, are now extinct. Things change, but that's talking about over 600 million years, that sort of time. The glaciations, for example, were not human caused, but the glaciations really affected New England in particular. And as the glaciers came down and then went back again over a period of 200,000 to a million years, probably affecting, that would have changed populations of birds and polar bears and earthworms and you name it. There are probably very few native earthworms in New England nowadays because those glaciations came down and earthworms don't like glaciers. So, but then other earthworms are introduced. So, you know, we have certainly changed. We have introduced a lot of things. People have been, in my opinion, the biggest source of change. But over the longer terms, birds are extremely good indicators of what we are doing. If we can conserve in our own backyards and feed our birds and get them through the winter and then have healthier bird populations in our yards at least, even if there is less habitat for them in the whole area, then we are doing something individually. If we are supporting conservation organizations within our towns or within our counties or within our states or even nationally or internationally, then we are all doing our part to try to slow down the changes that are deleterious that are caused by humans. And so even just using less pesticide in your backyard is a good thing, right? So, you know, a rambling answer, but a very broad question, and it probably covers half a dozen other questions as well.
That was a good answer. You did touch on what we can do in our own backyards using less pesticides or herbicides. Are there other minor tweaks that we might encourage our grandchildren to do, our neighbors to do?
You have to think what birds eat. And birds eat berries, and birds eat seeds, and birds eat insects. Pretty much all of the land birds and a lot of the shorebirds are, when they're young, are eating insects. Even birds that we think of as seed eaters, like sparrows and buntings, will provide a lot of insect or invertebrate food to their young during the breeding season. So think what a bird would like. Go and look at Manomet, and we have a wildlife garden there, and we have preserved as much of the native scrubby, shrubby habitat around. In fact, our research on the bird banding continues on that, on about 20 acres of the Manomet property. But we have tried to leave in tree cover. You can do this in your backyard. You can put in shrubs because trees and shrubs will provide cover for birds against predators. I have 2 Cooper's hawks and 1 Sharp-shinned hawk who make visits occasionally here, and the birds are very excited to be able to dive into the nearest vegetation. So I take my Christmas tree and put it outside, and they can go and hide in that. You can provide water during periods when it's very dry, and that would be useful for birds. You have to keep things clean. You can provide food, which is A, fun for us because we can see the birds, and B, get them over the cold snaps like this. The last 2 mornings in Plimpton, it's been 5 degrees, not good. And so as long as they can continue to eat, they can do that. And yes, cut back, but you don't necessarily have to have acres of closely cropped lawn. If you were to let part of your lawn grow into natural grasslands and more plants, then you would get more insects and again, bird food coming in that way. So think of it in terms of protection from avian predators and other predators. And it'd be really nice not to have your cat roaming around and killing large numbers of birds outside. My wife and I had cats, and we do indoor cats.
Those are good tips. Okay, I have another question. I have a logistic question for the circles. You mentioned that it's an 11-mile diameter, but how do you split up groups if there's something like a large mountain range within the circle?
Oh, every circle is different. Yeah. What we did was just get a bunch of topo maps and paste them all together and draw a circle and cut it around and stick it up on the wall and then think about it. Assuming that you can get half a dozen different groups, shall we say, or in some cases it may only just be individuals. You can draw any parameters you like. What we have done is we have made sure that I think we have 6 areas that we basically cover. And as long as it's not too freezing cold, and there is some open water, and there's a lot of open water in Plymouth, for example, in our area, then the inland folks will see waterfowl and be able to count those. If everything freezes up, then many of those water birds, as now, will be moving into the few large bodies of fresh water that are still unfrozen, maybe Great Herring Pond, but they're freezing rapidly with this sort of temperature. So then they move to the coast. So what we did was put 5 different areas down along the coast so that people would be able to have enough time to really cover their section and then move those lines inland. But I think it depends very much where you are, and you know, different folks have different ways of doing it. You could do it by counties, you could do it by all sorts of things.
Thanks, Trevor. I have another question, and Lisa says, can you speak about the northern pine grosbeak? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Visit decades ago. She witnessed hundreds around 1967 or so in the backyard feeder. Do we see any around here now? She says the yellow, black with some white feathers grosbeak.
Yes, those grosbeaks were,
Grosbeaks, thank you.
yes, those grosbeaks comes from the French gros bec, big beak, big nose, are very much feeders on the conifers. And so the evening grosbeak, which is the black and yellow and white male, and the pine grosbeak, which is a very large, rather pink, looks like a giant purple finch, are both northern species that would normally have come down. Evening grosbeak is the interesting one. Back before the 1900s, evening grosbeak was actually only found in the northwestern forests of North America, Canada and Alaska and some of the northern states. And then they spread all the way across the country. And so by 1970s, as Lisa points out, we would put a picnic table out behind Manomet, and we'd put some sunflower seeds on it, and we'd see 10, 20, 30 evening grosbeaks coming in there and feeding on those seeds. So that would be an example of the northern seed crop in the conifers has up years and down years. Why do trees do that? Good ecological question. Trees do that so that if their predators, which are evening grosbeaks, pine grosbeaks, crossbills, red squirrels, gray squirrels in some cases, mostly red squirrels, if they produce the same number of seeds from the pines over a large continuous area, then the number of seed predators would be able to eat most of the seeds. If they produce an abundance some years, then many of the seeds will fall to the ground and you'll get more forest, which is what trees like. And if you then have a down year, and that is coordinated, then the predators don't have enough food, and so they will move away. And in the case of the northern finches, they move down here. Yes, the evening grosbeaks, pine grosbeak numbers, as far as I know, it's never been a particularly common bird, the pink one. And pine grosbeak numbers are probably declining, but we have very little data on that. Evening grosbeaks certainly peaked, especially during the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then decreased again. And we do not really know why. Some of these birds are probably reacting to some of the pesticides that are used in the forests, but that's not so frequent now. Normally against some of the spongy moths or some of the spruce budworms that affect the northern forests. There was some aerial spraying, and that wasn't great. But the population seems to be dropping, and I think I'd have to say the evening grosbeak decline is still a bit of a mystery to many of us.
Okay, we're gonna close it out with a doozy of a question here. Saskia asks, Well, first she says, awesome recommendations. And then she says, can we ever find balance even though things change? That's a big one.
What's that saying that I can never quite remember? Le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose.
What is that?
Yes, as the more things change,
James, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. Excuse my French, non-French accent. I think that we in our own areas can try to produce the best environment that we can within our own backyards or around our own houses or even in our town with just our own bird feeders. We can be aware of all the things we shouldn't do, as we've just discussed. And the large conservation organizations now, I think, have more oomph. Bird protection has increased in this century. The Migratory Bird Protection Act of 1918 protected nearly all species except hunted and game birds. And the Endangered Species Act has done wonders in preserving diversity. Manomet feels that, yes, it's important, of course, to preserve species as much as we can, because we can't replace them, or at least not yet, not in the near future. And so we feel that the time to be able to affect the continuing diversity we'd all like to see for many, many reasons, including for our own benefits, is to look at species that are under some pressure now. Look at the graphs of the losers, look at the graphs of the species that are decreasing, and aim our conservation efforts by joining other people, by educating, and by affecting as much as we can state, town, national, and international organizations, and see if we can do something along those lines to preserve that stability. But stability is not the norm, so it'll change.
It's nice to end on that bit of hope. I appreciate that. Thanks, Trevor. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing that inspiring work. We have vowed to get the people back to their jobs, so let me just close it out here. If you want more Manomet, please visit our events page. We have a family winter seed sowing workshop coming up, a First Friday bird walk, and another small sit scheduled with shorebird biologist Liana D'Annunzio, which Trevor mentioned in his presentation. And to learn more, visit our website, manomet.org, or join the conversation on our socials. This small sit's going to be up on our YouTube channel if you want to share it with someone. And also, if you enjoyed today, we'd love for you to support our work directly with a donation online if you haven't already. So thank you so much, Trevor, and everyone for joining us today. That wraps up another edition of the Small Sit. Thanks for joining us, and we at Manomet Conservation Sciences wish you a warm and happy winter. Thanks so much. Go fill those bird feeders. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.